Welcome to your logical fallacy notes. I'm going to ask that you, as you watch this PowerPoint, fill in your notes that you got in class today and simply write the definitions that you're prompted to write down and pay attention to the examples in the right-hand column of the page to help you understand each fallacy. So we're going to start with the definition of what a logical fallacy is. And a logical fallacy is simply an inaccurate or intentionally misleading application of logic. So basically, it's trying to swindle the people who are listening to you or who are reading your argument by giving them misleading facts instead of giving them pure honesty. So you should write that definition where it says a logical fallacy is blank. And it's important to be able to recognize logical fallacies to avoid being exploited or swindled by a speaker or a writer. You want to know what you're reading is true, and you don't want to be tricked through another person's argument. It's also important to avoid using logical fallacies in your own argument. So as we work to build a researched argument on a topic of your choice, you don't want your argument or your speech to be filled with logical fallacies, because then you're just misleading your audience members and you're not as persuasive when you do that. So we're going to start with a group of fallacies underneath pathos. So all of these fallacies following this slide are among the most dangerous, manipulative, and common because they distract from the real issue or the topic that you're talking about, and they appeal to people's emotions in order to do that. So the first one that we're going to talk about is the either or fallacy, or the black or white fallacy. And this fallacy suggests that there are only two choices that exist when in fact there are more. So go ahead and write that definition down where it says black-white fallacy. And the type of appeal is pathos, because this appeals to people's emotions. So some examples. You could say, for the sake of learning, we must maintain the firmest kind of discipline, including corporal punishment in our public schools, or we can expect chaos, disorder, and the disintegration of education as we know it. It's simply giving two options here. You can either maintain discipline or chaos will ensue. And we know that those aren't the two only options involved in that subject. The second example says either we build a new school or our children will never go to college. We know that those are not the two only options. If you don't build a new school, it doesn't mean that your children will never go to college. However, the sentence appears that there are only two options. The next example of a logical fallacy is called slippery slope. And slippery slope points to a specific action and claims without support that the action will inevitably lead to tragic results. So for example, the first example on the PowerPoint says, if we start letting doctors remove life support systems from terminally ill patients, then who's next? Pretty soon they'll start killing ugly babies. Before you know it, no hospital or rest home in this country will be safe. It's genocide. So we go all the way from starting with life support systems and ending with genocide. So slippery slope just brings a bunch of domino actions or a domino effect after an initial statement that is very exaggerated. So it's kind of a scare tactic because you're not able to provide evidence that not letting doctors remove life support automatically creates genocide. It's an invalid scare tactic. Also, the DirecTV commercials are another example, and you are welcome to watch that clip of a DirecTV commercial where it simply creates a domino effect that if you do not get DirecTV, then all of this bad stuff will happen to you, when in fact none of the bad consequences have anything to do with DirecTV at all. The next pathos logical fallacy is bandwagon. And this definition is appealing to popularity or the fact that many people do something as an attempted form of validation. So the fact that everyone's doing it, that's why, according to your argument, people should believe you. So for instance, if you said 7 out of 10 doctors say acupuncture works, therefore it must work, well, you only surveyed 10 doctors, but you're saying because most of those 10 said it works, it has to work 100%. That would be false logic. Also, if you are in a situation where someone says everyone I know is voting for John Smoot, so he's obviously the best for president, that would be false logic as well, because everyone you know is probably not voting for John Smoot. And that doesn't necessarily mean that he is the best president. So whenever you say that everyone has it, everyone needs it, these would all be bandwagon appeals. So I'd like you to write down in the example box next to the picture some examples of common teenager bandwagon appeals that adults usually don't fall for, because teenagers like yourself like to use this appeal a lot. And then once you've written down some common bandwagon appeals that adults don't fall for, write down some bandwagon appeals that maybe you've used before where you've said everyone's doing this, everyone's doing that, and people have listened to you. The next logical fallacy is the ad hominem logical fallacy, and now we are moving into the ethos fallacies. So these fallacies ask us to put our trust in people or institutions, no matter who they are, and because these are logical fallacies, it means that these ethical fallacies are not credible, but we like to pretend that they are. So ad hominem, also known as the smear technique, is an attack directed on the character of the opponent rather than on the issue at hand. So if you only focus on your opponent's bad character and not the issue that you're arguing for, this would be ad hominem. So if you say my opponent is only saying that because he is a crazy liberal tree hugger, you're not focusing on the argument, rather you're focusing on his personal beliefs, which has nothing to do with the argument. It doesn't address the actual issue. So if you say, I'm not voting for someone because I hate their hair color, that would also be an ad hominem. You're focused on the person rather than the issue at hand. The next one is a popular one in advertisements, especially in commercials, and that is appeals to false authority. So again, this is an ethical appeal, so it's under the type of appeal for ethos. And the definition of this is setting up a person or source as an expert who has actual limited expertise, giving too much credit to a widely trusted institution or person. So this would be whenever you buy something because, let's say, Michael Jordan sponsors Gatorade. Well, Michael Jordan didn't actually create Gatorade, so therefore he doesn't have true authority over that product. If you say David Beckham signs autographs with Sharpie, so obviously Sharpie is the most reliable pen on the market, David Beckham has nothing to do with making Sharpies. He's a soccer player, so therefore it's not necessarily the most reliable pen if David Beckham is using it. On your notes, there's another example with Oprah. Oprah says that it is bad to eat after 6 p.m. We shouldn't eat after 6 p.m. If she says so, this would be false logic because what authority does Oprah have to tell us that? So go ahead and write down the example from the PowerPoint that you see for the false authority example. The last section of logical fallacies is the logos section, And these fallacies commit actual errors in reasoning, so jumping to wrong conclusions based on the evidence that you have. So the first one is hasty generalizations. And hasty generalizations is a conclusion based on too little evidence, suggesting a superficial investigation of an issue. So you're making a conclusion even though you don't have enough evidence to prove it. So the first one says, some of the people in the room oppose the project, so all people will too. So you are making an assumption there. You have no way to prove that all people will, even though some people oppose the project. If you say something like women don't enjoy watching sports, that's a generalized comment. All women do not fall under that category. If you look at the example on in the picture, rather, on the PowerPoint slide, it says all cats have 4 legs, I have 4 legs, therefore I am a cat. That would be a hasty generalization, because even if you have 4 legs, you are not necessarily a cat. The next one is the red herring tactic, and you might be familiar with red herring with literature. A red herring in literature is something that's going to kind of trick you into thinking something is going to happen to a character when actually it has nothing to do with what's going to happen to the character. So it's a trick. So a red herring tactic logical fallacy is an irrelevant issue introduced into a discussion to draw attention away from the central issue. So it's an off-topic statement. So for instance, in the first example, if you say I work 60 hours a week to support my family and I pay my taxes, you can't give me a parking ticket. That would be red herring, because working 60 hours a week to support your family and paying your taxes, that has really nothing to do with giving you a parking ticket. You're trying to make the person feel bad, but it's completely off topic of the parking ticket. The other example, I think there is a great merit in making the requirements stricter for graduate students. I recommend that you support it too. After all, we are in a budget crisis and we do not want our salaries affected. So there is a red herring there, because the central issue of granting stricter requirements is not addressed fully. Rather, you're addressing the budget crisis, not the graduate requirements. Begging the question is the next one. And begging the question distorts a claim by including a secondary idea that requires proof, though none is given. So you try and trick someone into thinking one thing with proof, but you don't really give proof that can be logically proven with evidence. So for example, if you said, since wealthy doctors control healthcare services, Americans can only expect the cost of medical treatments to escalate, you can't prove that Americans can only expect the cost of medical treatments to escalate. The writer has provided no evidence that doctors control healthcare services. The use of the word wealthy implies that doctors' incomes directly determine treatment costs. Both of those ideas muddy the logic of the argument, because we know that those do not correlate. And your last example of a logical fallacy is the non sequitur. And this one means that it does not follow. It presents a conclusion that is not the logical result of a claim or of evidence that precedes it. So for example, this car has a noisy engine, it must be fast. Well, just because a car has a noisy engine does not automatically mean it's fast. Those don't unnecessarily coincide with one another all the time. A car could have a noisy engine and be really slow. So that would be non sequitur, that the claim and the reason don't follow one another. They don't make sense. And that ends your logical fallacy notes. So make sure that you have all the definitions written down and write down any questions that you have, because tomorrow we will be practicing these logical fallacies in class and addressing any of these that you had issues with.